Welcome everyone to this Explainer Masterclass. I am absolutely thrilled you're here. Today, we are traveling way back in time, specifically to the 8th through 12th centuries, to explore what is undeniably one of the most intellectually vibrant and artistically sophisticated periods in all of early medieval Asian history. We're talking about the Pala Dynasty. Now, speaking as an art historian, I can tell you that the Pala era is just an absolute joy to study. Operating out of the fertile regions we now know as Bengal and Bihar, these rulers didn't just build your standard run-of-the-mill empire, not at all. They essentially engineered a massive trans-Asian cultural renaissance. Over the course of this masterclass, we are going to look closely at how their incredible mastery of literature, architecture, sculpture, and religious philosophy created a lasting aesthetic blueprint, and it's a blueprint that quite literally shaped the entire continent. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our syllabus for today, mapping out exactly how we'll trace the dynasty's cultural contributions. We have 5 key areas to cover. We'll start by grounding ourselves in the geographical and political roots of the Riverine Empire. From there, we'll explore the breathtaking, monumental architecture of the mahaviharas. Third, we're going to take a really deep dive into the very specific Pala's sculptural aesthetic. After that, we'll examine the profound impact of Tantric Buddhism on their art and society. And finally, we will trace how all of this culminated in a massive trans-Asian cultural legacy that outlasted the empire itself. So, Section 1, the Riverine Empire context and its geographical foundations. To really understand the incredible rise of the Palas, we first have to look at the absolute chaos that preceded them. Imagine the mid-8th century in Bengal. The region was suffering through a period of severe, debilitating political anarchy. Historical texts from the time actually describe this era using the term Matsya. This translates literally to the law of the fish. Think about a pond where the big fish relentlessly consume the small fish. Essentially, a brutal state of nature where complete disorder reigns supreme and everyone is out for themselves. The Pala dynasty was born directly out of a desperate collective desire for order. It got so bad that regional chieftains actually came together and elected a man named Gopala to be their ruler, just to end this chaotic fragmentation. And that election established the Pala line, with the word Pala appropriately meaning protector. From that incredibly rare moment of democratic election, the new dynasty moved very quickly to consolidate their power. Let's walk through the timeline. Gopala laid the foundational bedrock around 750 CE. Then his successor, Dharmapala, who ruled from roughly 770 to 810 CE, vastly expanded the empire's influence all across northern India. He's also the one who really started the massive monastic building projects we'll look at soon. But it was under the third ruler, Devapala, from 810 to 850 CE, that the Pala Empire reached its absolute zenith of military and cultural might. Backed by the immense agricultural surpluses of the incredibly fertile Gangetic Plain, as well as highly lucrative maritime trade routes, these kings suddenly found themselves with the vast economic resources required to fund a true artistic renaissance. Which brings us to Section 2, the architecture of the mahaviharas, those incredible monastic universities. When we talk about the great architectural achievements of the Palas, we are largely talking about mahaviharas. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand that these were not just isolated places of worship or simple, quiet temples. A mahavihara was a great monastic university. We are talking about highly sophisticated, totally self-sustaining economic entities. They were heavily funded by royal land grants and state taxation. Because of this immense medieval funding, these institutions acted as massive global hubs for advanced Buddhist scholarship, attracting brilliant students, scholars, and pilgrims from all over the known world. And the scale of these universities, it was simply staggering. We are looking at a vast, integrated network of institutions, places like Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odantapuri, and Somapura. At their height, major sites like Nalanda supported resident populations that easily exceeded 10,000 monks, scholars, and administrative staff. Think about the logistics of that for a medieval society. Their architectural genius is perhaps best illustrated by the famous Somapura Mahavihara, which was built by Dharmapala. It featured this massive cruciform plan entirely surrounded by a huge quadrangular enclosure. The podiums of these towering brick structures were clad in continuous, horizontal registers of unglazed terracotta plaques. And these plaques are amazing because they didn't just show lofty deities. They depicted a syncretic mix of everyday secular life. They give us a literal, physical window into what daily society looked like in early medieval Bengal. These massive structures were so impressive that they actually served as direct models for future Buddhist buildings all over the world. Moving right along to Section 3, the Pala sculptural aesthetic and its visual language. Alongside their massive buildings, the Pala sponsored an incredible upsurge in perfect stone carving. But to truly appreciate what they did, we have to compare it to what came right before them. The earlier Gupta school of art was incredibly famous for a very specific, elegant virtuosity. The Pala school took that basic, older foundation and entirely transformed it. The figures in Pala art became noticeably slimmer, longer, and much more rounded. Their stone of choice was often a fine black basalt, which they would polish to a remarkably smooth, almost metallic finish. Where the older Gupta art was relatively restrained and calm, the Pala style fully embraced highly elaborate decoration, often utilizing these fully flamed, dramatic stylings. Now, what's really interesting about this piece is the specific anatomy of the 9th century masterwork we are looking at. Notice that incredibly stylized, flamed halo that perfectly frames the head of the main figure. You can clearly see the distinct borders and the separate lotus seat down at the base. The carving features some lower grades of relief in certain background areas, which perfectly contrasts with the highly detailed curving ornamentation on the figure itself. Also, notice how the torso and the limbs are deliberately carved to be a bit stiffer and more columnar. It's a very intentional choice by the artist to project a profound sense of divine permanence and unshakable authority. Let's break down the exact aesthetic hallmarks you should always look for when trying to identify Pala art. First, look at the faces. They are almost perfectly oval, usually featuring sharp aquiline noses, along with very strongly defined lips and eyebrows. But the real unique identifier, it's the eyes. They are half-closed and heavily brooding. But unlike earlier, more serene styles with drooping eyelids, Pala eyes are never cast downwards. They look out. You'll also notice the figures wear very scanty clothing, usually just a short cotton dhoti. This allowed the master carvers to emphasize the rounded, physical charm of the body, which they then offset heavily with intricate, precious jewelry. Finally, always check the base. The main figure will invariably be accompanied by a separate lotus seat, resting on a pedestal that features either a pancharatna, which is a 5-projection design, or a triratna design. But this incredible aesthetic wasn't just limited to freestanding statues you'd put in a shrine. The Palas treated their actual structural architecture as a literal extension of their sculpture. Just look at the intricate integration here. You have a massive, lion-headed beam capping and highly detailed, deeply carved column shafts. Every single structural member, from the heavy entry door frames to the weight-bearing brackets and partition walls, was given immense sculptural value. They weren't just building structures, they were crafting a totally unified aesthetic environment where the building itself was the art. And, of course, we absolutely cannot discuss Pala art without highlighting their sheer metallurgical genius. They completely perfected the creation of small, highly detailed bronze sculptures. To do this, they utilized a famously intricate lost wax casting technique, pouring a very specific alloy made of 8 different metals. Because these bronzes were small and highly portable, intended mostly for individual, private worship, they became incredibly important vehicles. They were quite literally the seeds that spread Pala art all across Asia, as we're going to see in just a moment. But first, let's shift from the physical art to the philosophy that drove it in Section 4, Tantric Buddhism and Society. During the Pala era, the traditional Mahayana Buddhism that had dominated previously began to be heavily superseded by a newly emerging, powerful tradition known as Vajrayana. This was a highly esoteric, Tantra-imbibed version of Buddhism. It was a rigorous, complex system that required specific initiations and empowerments from a qualified guru to practice safely. Vajrayana focused heavily on mantras, which are sacred sounds, mudras, which are precise hand gestures, and mandalas, which are intricately visualized sacred spaces. This highly structured, esoteric ritual system is exactly why Pala art features such standardized, incredibly complex, multi-armed deities. Those figures aren't just decorative. They were highly specific visual tools required for these intense meditation practices. Now, within this complex esoteric landscape emerged a fascinating group known as the Mahasiddhas. These were great, realized master yogis who championed the concept of sahaja. Sahaja translates roughly to the innate. It's the direct realization of an already present awakened condition within yourself. Interestingly, these Mahasiddhas often harshly criticized the empty formalism and the scholastic pride of the very universities the Palas were building. And what's truly amazing is how they communicated. They composed esoteric songs using something called Sandhya Bhasha, which means intentional twilight language. These songs, compiled in a text called the Charyapada, actually represent the earliest known examples of Bengali literature. They deliberately used everyday worldly imagery, talking about potters, boatmen, and simple domestic life, to hide deep-coded yogic meanings from the uninitiated. It was a brilliant way to marry deep spiritual philosophy with the common vernacular language of the working people. So, while the Palas were undoubtedly devout Buddhist kings, a crucial point to understand is that they were not exclusive at all. They actively fostered a vibrant climate of religious pluralism across their empire. We actually have extensive historical records showing royal land grants being given to support Brahmanical temples dedicated to Hindu deities like Vishnu, Shiva, and Surya. Furthermore, the Jaina faith maintained a strong, continuing presence at major sites like Parpur. And on a grassroots level, local agrarian rights and regional goddess figures were deeply integrated into daily life. This incredibly inclusive, tolerant climate is exactly what allowed both Hindu and Buddhist intellectual and artistic traditions to not just survive, but to flourish simultaneously, side by side. Finally, let's explore how all of this reached beyond their borders in Section 5, a Trans-Asian cultural legacy. Okay, let's move to and see how this builds into a true global legacy. It happened in 3 main steps. Step 1. Those massive mahaviharas we talked about organized vast amounts of knowledge. They produced sophisticated literature, wrote heavy commentaries, and most importantly, copied their texts onto highly portable, beautifully illuminated palm leaf manuscripts. Step 2. International scholars and monks who had flocked to these centers eventually had to go home, so they traveled back via maritime and Himalayan trade routes, taking these fragile manuscripts and those small, portable bronze statues right along with them. Step 3. Once these physical items reached new lands, they acted like aesthetic and intellectual seeds. The specific Pala artistic idioms and their rich literary traditions were directly translated into the visual and textual worlds of completely foreign nations. And these diplomatic and cultural exchanges were highly formalized. For instance, the Pala king Devapala specifically granted the tax revenue of 5 entire villages, just to support an enclave of foreign scholars from the Sailendra dynasty of Indonesia who were studying at Nalanda. In the north, the legendary Pala scholar Atisha actually traveled across the Himalayas to Tibet in 1042 CE. His teachings there were so profound that they fundamentally shaped the entire trajectory of Tibetan Buddhism moving forward. Meanwhile, the distinct architectural layouts and bronze casting styles of the Palas were being heavily adopted in places as far away as Myanmar and Java. The cultural reach of this empire vastly exceeded its actual political borders. But tragically, the physical empire did come to a sudden and incredibly violent end. Between 1193 and 1207 CE, a devastating series of Turkic invasions swept rapidly across Bihar and Bengal. The great monumental mahaviharas, Odantapuri, Nalanda, Vikramashila, and finally Jagaddala were sacked and burned to the ground. The massive monastic communities were entirely dispersed. However, as the surviving scholars and artists fled for their lives into the remote safety of the Himalayas in Nepal and Tibet, they carried with them those precious portable bronzes and those fragile palm leaf manuscripts. The great physical institutions burned, yes, but the knowledge completely survived in the hands of the refugees. Which leaves us with a profound final thought for this masterclass. If the massive, towering brick universities of the Palas were destroyed well over 8 centuries ago, how is it that their specific aesthetic blueprint, those half-closed, brooding eyes, the complex, multi-armed deities, the precise mudras, how does all of that continue to definitively shape the spiritual and cultural heritage of Asia today? It is a powerful testament to the fact that while invading armies can conquer physical territory, they cannot easily extinguish a truly universal empire of ideas. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Pala Renaissance. Keep questioning, keep looking closely at the art around you, and I will see you in the next explainer.